Well, the tar sands are the single largest and most destructive industrial project on Earth. So when you're there, it feels a bit like Mordor. It's, as far as the eye can see, mines, basically mines, and huge open pits where toxic water is being pumped out into areas that are the size of lakes now. I mean, we have 100 million liters of toxic water being pumped out into those pits a day. And for many years, this was a massive controversy that polarized the country, and of course many people heard about it internationally, and it really paralyzed climate policy in Canada. And I think in the last year we've made some major breakthroughs. It's not over, but we've made some major breakthroughs.
What is it? Just a bit more about the scent. What does it smell like? What is it? Can you taste the sort of atmosphere of the tar sands when you're walking around, or is it just more a visual spectacle?
No, you can smell it and feel it. I mean, it smells bad, and it's incredibly toxic, the process. So if you spend more than a couple of hours walking around in the tar sands, then your eyes start to run and your skin starts to hurt. And of course, we're starting to see the impacts downstream. There are many incidences of rare cancer in downstream Indigenous communities as a result of the industrial activities of the tar sands.
Sure. And so you've been engaged in talking to some of the companies about their climate targets. Give us a sense about how those conversations were initiated, and also a sense about what incentive there is for. Why would a tar sands company want to talk to you, and why would it want to sort of seriously take climate action that seriously?
Well, the fact is that the oil companies have been a little bit between a rock and a hard place, because the controversy around tar sands development has been so huge, and the campaign's really so effective around the world. I would say that the climate movement and Indigenous groups have stopped or delayed every single pipeline that has been proposed in North America to come from the tar sands in the last 10 years. And so the result is, it is one of the largest pools of carbon on the planet, but it's landlocked. If you can't get it out, you can't expand. You can't get the oil to market. They have very little social license to get approvals. And so I think a lot of the companies wanted to talk to us to start looking at climate policy, because they're hoping to impact their brands to look like green companies. On our side, I would say a lot of the environmental community wanted to talk to the companies, because in a place like Alberta that is 70% dependent on oil, the economy is 70% dependent on oil, whether or not it's a quite progressive government that believes in climate change, which we finally have now after 44 years of a far-right conservative government that refused to work on climate change, even a progressive government won't move on the issue, because civil society in Alberta won't support it. They would lose the next election, because unless some of the oil companies would stand up and say this is good for the economy, they wouldn't do it. But I also think that the oil companies some of the more progressive ones wanted to look at climate policy and support climate policy, because they want a higher price on carbon to incent new technologies. There are ways to decrease emissions and the toxic impact of the tar sands, but it costs money.
I mean, are they worried? What's behind this? So was it the Paris Agreement?
Sure.
Was it crashing prices in oil, which makes tar sands a lot unviable to a degree in terms of extraction? I mean, what's behind that?
The lower oil price makes new development more difficult. But the fact is, for tar sands, the majority of the financial cost goes in at the forefront. So we currently produce over 2 million barrels per day. There's another 600,000 barrels per day under construction. Capital's already in for that. So the low oil price doesn't affect whether or not those projects go forward. But I would say that a number of oil companies like Suncor, I was on the stage yesterday with Steve Williams, the CEO of Suncor, they see the writing on the wall, I mean, from Paris to the Pope. They know.
And you think that'll mean some of them keep it in the ground then, that they'll keep some of their supplies or reserves that are there, they won't see the light of day, so to speak?
Well, yes, because they've now agreed to an emissions limit. So one of the pieces of legislation that was passed this year was the first ever emissions limit in the tar sands, which is, to be clear, this is not policy that is equivalent, say, to a goal of 1.5 world or a 2-degree world. However, it's like all climate policy in the climate era. It's historic and insufficient. But it does cap emissions at a rate which essentially at today's technology mothballs over a third of the permits that have already been approved. So millions of barrels per day of oil will now not be developed and will be kept in the ground because of that emissions limit. And so in that respect, it's historic, and the companies would agree to it because the more progressive companies believe that they will be allowed to produce under the limit because they're going to be the cleanest. They're big enough, they have enough money to put in place technologies to reduce emissions. Their goal is to reduce emissions per barrel.
Do you think we're going to see tar sands produced at that scale in 10 years' time?
I don't. I mean, right now it's a gamble. I think the oil sands companies believe that they can reduce emissions to equivalent to conventional, and that they will be able to produce and compete for whatever smaller piece of the pie oil makes up of global energy use in the future. Maybe that's true. I think they have a tough hill to climb because it's one of the most expensive fuels on the planet. It's one of the highest carbon fuels on the planet, and it still is extremely controversial. But my goal as an environmental advocate is to get in place climate policy, a price on carbon in Alberta, an emissions limit, because in doing that, we unlocked the polarization of Canadian climate policy. The Canadian government played a big role in Paris, pushing for 1.5, a progressive role. In fact, for a country like Canada, punched way above its weight. And that's a really good thing. And we now have a conversation about a national climate policy in the country. We didn't before, in large part because we had a federal government that was protecting the oil industry. Now that we have an oil industry that is in part supporting climate policy, everything's moving.
Just a couple more questions. In terms of the wildfires, how has that changed has it changed the narrative around climate change, or is that just something that happens in Canada and people just deal with it?
I think there is no question that the wildfires have changed the narrative. It was, sure, wildfires happen in the Boreal all the time, not to this scale, and everybody knows it. I mean, the nickname of this fire was called the Beast. It destroyed 1.5 million acres of land in Canada. 100,000 people were evacuated. That on top of the fact that 2 years ago we had the biggest floods that we've ever seen. So Canadians are starting to see the impacts of climate change as a result of extreme weather, and the majority of Canadians believe in climate change and want action on climate change now. So I think the fires had a huge impact, but they also had an impact with people rallying around Fort McMurray. I mean, the fires happened in the heart of the oil sands, and a lot of people are saying we need to support Fort McMurray and rebuild Fort McMurray. And so what does that mean? How much oil sands in the future? It's a conversation that we're only just starting to have in a much more transparent way. So we'll see.
Okay, just a final question then. We've got the divestment campaign, we've got the engagement campaign. There are many environmentalists who would not be seen dead in the same room as oil companies and might look at what you've done and say that in some way it's betrayed their course. It strikes me that you're not divestment, not engagement, investment or engagement, but what lessons, apart from those ridiculous plans, what lessons do you think you have learned or other people could learn from what you've been up to?
Well, first of all, I want to say that I do support the divestment campaign. I've spoken out very publicly in Canada as a recipient of an honorary doctorate from the UBC calling for divestment. And I am probably just as likely to be blockading a coal plant or an oil terminal than I am to be in a boardroom talking with a CEO of an oil company. And I think the lesson of that is we need all hands on deck. We need all tools in our tool belt. And if we need to get oil companies supporting climate policy in order to get that legislation to be passed, then I'm going to get oil companies to support climate policy. And, you know, the solutions in the climate era aren't black or white. They're various shades of gray. And we're not going to go from no climate policy to policy equivalent to 1.5 degrees overnight. And so I'm going to do everything I can to ratchet up climate policy and also to support a growing and thriving movement that is calling for the types of actions that we need to meet the scientific thresholds and ensure climate safety. So it's not an either or. I think it's both.